When I first started reading Phasma, something felt off, and I got halfway through the first page before I realised what it was, and when I did, I had this horrible flashback to the Aftermath trilogy. You see, Delilah S. Dawson chose to write Phasma in third person present tense, just like Wendig did with the Aftermath trilogy. However, unlike the Aftermath trilogy, Dawson hasn't done it because she's a boring writer that needed something, anything, to catch people's attention. She's done it because it makes sense, and it really, really works. Phasma is set sometime between Bloodline and The Force Awakens and tells the story of the interrogation of the Resistance spy Vi Moradi at the hands of Captain Cardinal, Captain Phasma's counterpart in the programming of the First Order Stormtroopers. Most of the book takes place in a dank interrogation room where Vi is strapped to a torture chair. The thing Cardinal wants from her is information about Phasma, anything that can have her court-martialed and expelled from the First Order. The only way Vi can survive, and hopefully escape, is by giving him what he wants. The interrogation scenes are interesting, and because the interrogation is set in the present, having these parts of the book written in third person present tense makes sense, because in the chapters where Vi tells Cardinal Phasma's story, they are entirely written to be the dialogue she's actually saying to Cardinal. So the writing switches to third person past tense the same way anyone would tell a story. Deliberately separating sections into past and present, splitting the story in two and mixing up the points of view gave the book great pacing, as nothing really gets too old. As soon as you think Cardinal might push too far and seriously harm Vi, she's off again talking about Phasma's past. And the thing is, because both Vi and Cardinal are new characters and we haven't seen them in The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi, you really do get a sense that one, or most likely both given the situation, would probably die before the end of the book. Phasma's story itself is really interesting and starts when she was in her late teens and ends with her being the Phasma we all know she's meant to be, even though we never actually see it on screen. It's basically the same treatment James Luceno gave to Tarkin, and it works really well with Phasma, because while I enjoyed her enough in The Force Awakens, she didn't really do much. She had a role to play in The Force Awakens and she fulfilled it, and I got a laugh from her little head tilt when Finn and Han were talking about putting her in the garbage chute, but she definitely wasn't the strong, fierce and fearless fighter I was expecting her to be. We got even less of Phasma in The Last Jedi, with absolutely no explanation of how she escaped Starkiller Base, because Rian Johnson clearly didn't give a shit, instead giving us flying horse goat things and forced synthetic romance. I know it's explained in the Captain Phasma comic, but had Johnson done his job properly, there wouldn't have been any need for a comic explaining it at all. So the Phasma novel is really the first time we actually get to see Phasma as completely and utterly ruthless. Since Phasma's introduction in The Force Awakens, after both hearing her name and seeing her armour, I had always thought Captain Phasma was some kind of a code name, honorary title, or name she'd chosen for herself at some point in her life. I knew that Captain was her actual rank, but the idea of someone actually being called Phasma just struck me as bizarre, and that's exactly what's revealed in the book. It seems particularly odd when you consider the fact that people who grew up around her had relatively normal sounding names like Egil or Por, and even her brother is named Keldo. The first act sets up Phasma's story, and much like the Tarkin novel, it was interesting and not at all what I expected. At no point since Phasma's introduction in The Force Awakens did I expect Phasma's origins to be a cave by the sea with a group of people who are so technologically impaired that when it rains they have to tie themselves to rocks so they don't fall into the sea. It gives new definition to the term Third World, and I found it pleasantly surprising because rather than seeing Phasma's origins rooted somewhere in a civilised world, we can see her grow from a tribal warrior into a responsible leader. I think it was a good choice, and the first act alone sees Phasma grow from just a warrior to a ruthless, conniving, manipulating bitch. It also introduces the First Order in the form of a few stormtroopers and Brendel Hux, who was last seen in Empire's End. Brendel Hux doesn't grow much throughout the book, but we do get a good look at his character, far more than we ever got in Empire's End, and I was surprised to discover that he was an interesting character. He's not necessarily a good guy, but he's still interesting, and only shows how poorly the Aftermath trilogy was written. If I find Brendel Hux interesting here, why did I find him so boring in Empire's End? Because of Chuck Wendig's inability to write a single interesting sentence. So I thought Phasma had a good, strong start, and I liked it. The second act dragged a bit for me, and I think it was because Dawson tried to include too many things, as well as dropping the story in the present, focusing almost exclusively on Phasma and her band in the past. It had 3 separate events, and considering all the protagonists were doing was crossing a desert, that seems to be a lot, and what really made me shake my head was the fact that each section seemed to be based on some kind of popular movie. Where George Lucas borrowed from many things to create the original trilogy, he always mixed it up enough so that what he was influenced by wasn't directly in the viewer's face. Dawson hasn't done that here, and at times has directly copied scenes and even lines from movies. The first part is the acclimation to the desert, the environment, the blazing heat and the wildlife. For some reason one of the characters develops a disease and becomes severely ill. Eventually he becomes a big blob of water contained only by his skin, and when his body can fight no more, he essentially explodes and collapses at the same time in a massive amount of water. For me, this is a straight copy of the way Senator Kelly died in the first X-Men movie after Magneto used his machine on him. There was no variation whatsoever, it was just clearly copied from the movie. The second part of the desert trek sees the group find an abandoned station filled with malfunctioning androids that sought to control the group and set them to work. They had a religious fervour about them due to them being improperly maintained, and cracks were beginning to show in their systems, including praising their now non-existent creators and at one point even attacking the group. Sound familiar? It should. To me this is a straight up copy of Ash from Alien, and even the Seegson androids from Alien Isolation, which itself was based on the first Alien movie. So far that's 2 for 2 where Dawson has straight up stolen from movies. The third one is even more obvious. The third and final part of Act 2 sees the group captured and forced to fight in an arena. Have a guess at which movie this section copies. Yep. Gladiator. Not only is Phasma the one person who will stand up to the evil tyrant much the same way Maximus stood up to the false emperor, but Dawson had even used the same phrasing in Maximus' famous "Are you not entertained?" line, in the form of having Brendel Hux ask, "Was the Aratu not entertained?" Admittedly, the way the group resolved the situation was exceptionally cool, highlighting the warrior Phasma really is, but it's not enough to cover up the fact that Dawson has just rewritten scenes from movies. That's 3 things in 3 sections of the book in a row, and it's bullshit. I don't need Star Wars to be X-Men, Alien or Gladiator. I need it to be Star Wars. I can't understand why nobody read this and told Dawson to sort her shit out. I don't want to call it plagiarism, because for the most part, Phasma is a strong book and Dawson's writing is good, so I'd like to think it's just influences she's integrated into the book, but she should have masked it better, mixed it up better, and at the very least it should have been caught by proofreaders and editors. It's funny because according to Wikipedia, Dawson used a Spotify playlist while writing Phasma. It consisted mostly of music from Star Wars and Mad Max Fury Road. Once she got going, she'd put on violent films on Netflix as an inspiration. I can believe that. Not only do I believe it, but I can tell you what films they were. X-Men, Alien and Gladiator. It's that fucking obvious. And the music from Mad Max clearly inspired the desert trek in the first place. The third act wraps everything up and is mostly focused on the present, with only the odd trip into Phasma's past. It wraps up the story well, and something I did find interesting was Phasma's face. After she has her face broken in the gladiator portion of the book, no one ever sees her face again except for right at the very end, and I thought that fitted her character perfectly because even though we know Gwendoline Christie is under the helmet in the movies, we never actually see her. You got to see her eye in a deleted scene Johnson refused to put in The Last Jedi, but apart from that, you never see her face. So I thought including that aspect of her personality in the book and how she got to be that way was a good inclusion. I wasn't overly impressed with the way Phasma got her chrome armour, but it wasn't the worst bit of writing in the world. The idea that she would go back to Parnassus and use one of the factories there to make her armour just seemed off to me, considering she spent the entire book trying to escape Parnassus forever. Like I said, it's not the worst bit of writing, but it does contradict with the character Dawson wrote about throughout the entire book. There are what I can only describe as the most random references in Phasma. Of all the movies, books, shows, comics and games, the one thing Dawson has chosen to reference in Phasma is Anakin's "I hate sand" speech from Attack of the Clones. It came out of nowhere and I wasn't expecting it, and much like Maximus's speech, it's almost word for word the same lines from the movie, including the words rough, irritating, coarse and gets everywhere. And I found it to be more than a little cringeworthy. Later on, she also quotes Vader by having one of the characters say, "most impressive." It's fan service, I get it, but I think things like that should be limited to once per book or comic, and that's if they have to have it at all. In my mind, if the story and lore are good, there should be no need for fan service of any kind. Dawson also has a habit of using the phrase "for all that", and it's quite annoying, because not only did she use it 3 or 4 times on one page, every 20 or so pages, but most of the time she does use it, she does so in a grammatically incorrect way, and it really grates when reading it. She'll use it at the beginning of a sentence, in the middle, or at the end, with absolutely no regard for whether it actually makes sense for the phrase to be there. It's like that one kid who learned a new word and uses it whenever he can, just to show off that he knows the word, even if it makes no sense, or if he uses it 3 or 4 times in one sentence. Reading Phasma is like listening to that kid. In fact, she used the phrase so many times I decided to download the ebook and use Adobe's search function to find out exactly how many times she did in fact use it, and I was utterly shocked by the results. Dawson used the phrase "for all that" no fewer than 32 times, and I'm convinced that's wrong, that the number is actually closer to 60. To put 32 times in perspective, that's 32 times in a book that's 378 pages long, and that means on average you'll read the phrase once every 12 pages. That's far too many times for one phrase to appear in any book on the best of days, let alone when it's used incorrectly. Just when you think you'll never read it again, you start to forget about it and it pops up yet again. You think sand's irritating and gets everywhere? It's got nothing on the phrase "for all that." Surely someone proofread this. Surely an editor stepped in. Where's the quality control, for fuck's sake? You see, while I did like the rest of Dawson's writing, there was something in the acknowledgements that actually made sense and explained why she's allowed this one thing to drag down an otherwise enjoyable book. Here's a quote from it. "Thanks to my best buddies, Kevin Hearn and Chuck Wendig, who passed on their priceless knowledge about writing canon." She does go on to name some other people, including Timothy Zahn, but when the first 2 people you thank for helping you write a Star Wars book are Kevin Hearn and Chuck Wendig, I think that says it all. Kevin Hearn wrote what is, in my opinion, one of the top 4 worst books in the new canon, Heir to the Jedi, which focused on Luke flirting, playing with noodles, fighting flying toast, and, in my opinion, completely misconstrued the nature of the Force and how a Force-sensitive person connects to it. Chuck Wendig wrote the other 3 worst books, which were Aftermath, Life Debt and Empire's End, which focused on nothing really at all. It was about 1200 pages of pure unadulterated drivel. There's a particular phrase in Phasma where Vi Moradi says, "I'm a resistance fighter, of course I'm going to resist," which really reminded me of one of the Aftermath books where Nora Wexley thinks to herself, "You're a rebel, rebel." And either it's one hell of a coincidence, or Chuck Wendig had a lot more influence on Dawson than she admitted. Considering Dawson had Wendig and Hearn guiding her, she hasn't done too badly. In fact, Phasma is better than any Star Wars book either of them has put out, but I do feel like their input has had a negative effect on the book. I also felt like some of the wildlife Dawson was describing was just far too close to the Star Wars Holiday Special by describing Earth animals, such as dogs, and actually naming chickens and raptors. To be fair to Dawson, perhaps it wasn't actually a dog, perhaps it was a Vornska. Here's a quote from the book. "Phasma snorted, watching the always smiling people on the green lawn throw a red ball for a four-legged animal with a floppy tongue to chase. Not only does that sound like a dog to me, but it also sounds like the description of the quintessential American suburban family. Even Cardinal himself is named after a bird here on Earth, and that's not just me guessing, it's explicitly stated in the book that he's named after a red bird. Combine that with actually naming chickens and raptors, and you get a whole lot more Earth in this book than any Star Wars book should ever have, and while it's not in the book much, what was there really felt out of place. I thought Vi Moradi and Cardinal were interesting characters, but given the way Disney and Pablo Hidalgo have treated the new expanded universe, we'll probably never hear from them again, which is a shame. Phasma is yet another book that carries the Journey to the Last Whatever banner on its cover, this time being Journey to the Last Jedi, and for the life of me I can't work out why. Just like Leia, Princess of Alderaan, it's set before The Force Awakens, and the only characters in Phasma that are actually in The Last Jedi are Phasma herself and Armitage Hux. If you count name dropping but never actually appearing, then you could include Kylo Ren and Snoke if you wanted to. But it's set before The Force Awakens, so I see no reason for it to have the Journey to the Last Jedi banner. If it had been set between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, that would have been fine, but it isn't. And it seems like whatever books Disney have coming out near a movie, whether the book has anything to do with the movie or not, they'll just stick a banner on the front cover to attract attention, and it's wrong. Inferno Squad didn't have Journey to Battlefront 2 on the cover, but nobody didn't understand that the book led up to the game, so Disney really should stop putting banners on books referencing movies when the book has absolutely nothing at all to do with a movie. It feels like false advertising, but let's be honest, Disney owns everything. They can do what they want and are basically the empire now. So overall I did like Phasma, but it has a hell of a lot of drawbacks that I find to be quite simply unforgivable. Blatantly ripping off other franchises without the slightest attempt to blur it into the rest of the mix so it's not obvious, massive overuse of the phrase for all that, and its improper use at least 32 times throughout the entire book, really brought the book down for me and made the book a bit of a chore to get through. And so much Earth-based stuff that quite simply should never have made it into the book. Having said that, I really liked the rest of Dawson's writing, and I liked the opening and closing act. I thought having the story told in third person present tense then switching to third person past tense was a great way to mix up the format of the book and keep things fresh, keeping the reader interested the whole way through. I also thought she did well fleshing out Brendol Hux, a character I thought I'd never read about again because when Wendig introduced him he was boring, just like every character in the Aftermath trilogy. And of course watching Phasma herself grow from a teenager living in a cave by the sea to the chromium-clad warrior we all want her to be was pretty cool, and Dawson gets some points because out of the two movies Phasma has been in, none of them come remotely close to showing her as a warrior as well as Dawson has in Phasma. I think Phasma is an excellent example of someone having good writing ability but still needing guidance and direction, and for some reason Dawson seemed to get none of it except from the authors who were widely considered to be the worst authors in the new canon, and that's a hell of a shame. I'd like to see Dawson write another book, this time without the influence of two people who have no idea what they're doing, and with an editor who isn't afraid to tell her to stop taking scenes from incredibly famous movies and focus on writing something of her own, and to stop using one phrase incorrectly throughout the entire book. She needs an editor and proofreaders that will do their jobs properly, and I feel like she didn't get that here, and that blame falls squarely on Del Rey and Disney. And once again I have to ask the question of why they didn't support one of their authors properly yet again. In spite of that, the maddening overuse of the phrase for all that, and the glaringly obvious rip-offs of popular movies, I thought Phasma was a good book. It had great pacing, interesting characters and an interesting plot, and it's the only piece of media released that I've experienced where Phasma acts like the tough bitch you expected her to be in the movies, so I do think it's worth reading.